I'm just going to talk about one industry today because it disproportionately impacts the people of this state, and that's coal-burning power plants like the one right down river here. I have 3 sons who have asthma. 1 out of every 4 black children in America's cities now has asthma. We know that, and we have a pediatric asthma epidemic in this country. Everybody's conscious of it. We know that the principal trigger for the asthma attacks themselves is bad air, mainly ozone and particulates. About 75% of asthma attacks are caused by those 2 substances. And the principal source of that material in our atmosphere is 400 coal-burning power plants that are burning coal illegally. It's been illegal for 18 years. The Clean Air Act said you had to remove the ozone and particulates before you can discharge from the stacks. And in fact, many of those plants, about half of them, about 400 other plants, did remove the ozone and particulates. Like in my state, Massachusetts, and Bobby's state, all of them did. And in New York State, many of the other states, generally what you saw is in the blue states, they complied with the law and did it. But in the red states, where corporations can easily dominate the state political landscapes, they weren't required to comply with the law. The Clinton administration was prosecuting the worst 52 of those plants criminally and civilly for violating the law. But this is an industry that donated $156 million to President Bush and his party since the year 2000, since the 2000 election cycle. One of the first things the Bush administration did when it came into office was to order the Justice Department and EPA to drop all of those lawsuits. The top 3 enforcers at EPA, Bruce Buckheit, Sylvia Lawrence, and Eric Schaefer, all resigned their jobs in protest. These were not Democrats. These were people who had worked through the Reagan administration and the previous Bush administration. The top Justice Department attorney, a Republican, said this has never happened before in American history, where a presidential candidate accepts money from criminals under indictment and orders those cases dropped when he achieves office. Immediately after doing that, President Bush abolished the new source rule, the heart and soul of the Clean Air Act, the most important provision in that statute. That's the rule that required those companies to clean up 18 years ago. So now there's no requirement that they ever have to clean up the ozone and particulates. And all of those plants in Massachusetts and elsewhere that invested in the new technologies are now at a profound disadvantage in the marketplace. And I'm going to be able to watch my children gasping for air on bad air days because somebody gave money to a politician. And if you go to EPA's website, when you go home today, not NRDC's website or Waterkeeper's website, but the federal government's own website, you will see that that single decision alone by President Bush to abolish the new source rule kills 24,000 people every year. That's the low estimate. The high estimate is 60,000, and that's the most accurate one by the Harvard study. But the low estimate is 24,000. That's 6 times the number of people who were killed in the World Trade Center attacks, but not just once, year after year after year after year. This should be the front page headline of every newspaper in this country every day. A lot of those people are here in the state of Kentucky. This is the highest concentration on this river of coal-burning power plants anywhere in the country. And if you, about 5 years ago, the federally, and I'm going to be able to watch my children gasping for air on bad air days because somebody gave money to a politician. Now, 5 years ago, the federal EPA announced that in 19 states, including Kentucky, every fish in the state is now so contaminated with mercury that they're unsafe to eat. In 49 states, at least some of the fish have mercury advisories. In fact, the only state, and the mercury is coming by and large from those same coal-burning power plants. The only state where all of the fish are still safe to eat is Wyoming, where Dick Cheney's home state, where the Republican-controlled legislature has refused to appropriate the money to test the fish. But in all the other states, at least some, most, or all the fish are unsafe to eat. We know a lot about mercury we didn't know a few years ago. We know, for example, that according to CDC, 1 out of every 6 American women now has so much mercury in her womb that her children are at risk for a grim inventory of diseases: autism, blindness, mental retardation, heart, liver, and kidney disease. I just came back from Shippingport, Pennsylvania. So they have a coal-burning power plant that's still discharging mercury illegally. And in one elementary school class, there are 8 children who have autism. And a recent study by the University of Texas says that autism rates are dramatically higher in the downwind plumes of those plants, and special education needs dollars are much, much larger in schools that are within the downwind those plants than elsewhere. So I have so much mercury in my body. I got my levels tested recently. Every woman of childbearing years has to get her levels tested. Everybody should, because mercury is a potent neurotoxin. It's associated with early onset Alzheimer's and dementia and memory loss, etc. But women particularly, because it's so damaging to children in their fetal stages. And you can do it by going to our website, Waterkeeper Alliance, and send us a little lock of your hair. We'll send you back your mercury levels. My levels are, just from eating fish, 2.5 times what EPA considers safe. If you ever eat tuna fish, or if you ever eat sushi, you got to get them tested right away. My levels are, as I said, double what EPA considers safe. I was told by Dr. David Carpenter, who's the national authority on mercury contamination, that a woman with my levels of mercury in her blood would have children with cognitive impairment, permanent brain damage. I said to him, she might have. And he said, no. The science is very certain now. Her children would have some level of permanent neurological injury. Probably, he estimated, at the levels that I have, a permanent IQ loss in those kids of 5 to 7 points. Well, today, according to CDC, there are 640,000 children born in this country every year who've been exposed to dangerous levels of mercury in their mother's wombs. The Clinton administration, recognizing the gravity of this national health epidemic, reclassified mercury as a hazardous pollutant under the Clean Air Act. That triggered a requirement that all of those plants remove 90% of the mercury within 3.5 years, including this one down here. And it would have cost them less than 1% of plant revenues. And we know that it works. We know that when they remove the mercury within 5 years, it mainly disappears from the fish in the waterways downstream, downwind of that plant. So it was a great deal for the American people, but still billions of dollars for that industry. And that's the industry that gave $156 million to this administration. And 3 years ago, the White House announced that it was abolishing the Clinton-era rules and substituting instead rules that were written by utility industry lobbyists that will require the industry to never have to remove the mercury. The new rules, incidentally, were written by a law firm called Latham & Watkins, which does a lot of good things, but at that time, they were the principal lobbying firm for the worst of the worst of the worst of these utilities, companies like the Southern Company, which is just a criminal enterprise. And the top lobbyist for that law firm was a man named Jeffrey Homestead, and he's the guy that President Bush chose to run the Air Division of the EPA. So he just took language that he wrote when he was a lobbyist for these companies and turned it into American law and saved billions of dollars for his buddies by imposing tens of billions of dollars in costs on the rest of us. And I'll just tell you the rest of the story, because we sued him to stop him from doing that. And we forced them, it took them an extra 2 years to do it. When they finally got it done, the day after they promulgated those regulations, Homestead's top 2 deputies, who were former lobbyists for the Southern Company, resigned their jobs at EPA and went back to work for Southern Company, their public service having been done. And Philip Cooney, the guy I was talking about, who's the president's #1 environmental advisor, when this New York Times series recently aired, he was forced out of the White House, and 2 days later he was hired by Exxon Corporation. And in fact, he never stopped working for Exxon. It's just that you and I were paying him for the past 7 years. And Jeffrey Homestead just left EPA finally to go to work for Bracewell Giuliani, which is Rudy Giuliani's Texas-based lobbying firm, and they are now the principal lobbying firm for the Southern Company. So this is this revolving door of plunder that you get when you allow polluters to run a democracy. And we're living in a science fiction nightmare today, where my children and every child in this state, and most of the children in America, can now no longer engage in the seminal primal activity of American youth, which is go fishing with their father and mother in the local fishing hole, and then come home and safely eat the fish, because somebody gave money to a politician.